Chapter 1. Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get up to any mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he could get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then she went out, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, "Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine." "No, Grandma," said George. "And just try and behave yourself while she's away." "Yes, Grandma," George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there was never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at the pigs and the hens and the cows and the sheep, and he was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grizzly old grunion of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. "You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start," Grandma said to George. "That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes." "Yes, Grandma," George said. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small puckered-up mouth, just like a dog's bottom. "How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma?" George asked her. "1 spoon," she said, "and no milk." Most grandmas are lovely, kind and helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day, every day, sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining and grousing and grouching and grumbling, griping about something or another. Never once, even on her best days, had she ever smiled at George and said, "Well, how are you this morning, George?" Or, "Why don't you have a game of snake and ladders?" Or, "How was school today?" She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. "It's not sweet enough. Put sugar in it." George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carefully carried it into Grandma. "Where's the saucer?" she said. "I won't have a cup without a saucer." George fetched her a saucer. "And what about a teaspoon?" "I've stirred it for you already, Grandma. I've stirred it well." "I will stir my own tea, thank you very much. Fetch me a teaspoon." George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were home, Grandma never ordered George around like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began treating him so badly. "You know what's the matter with you?" the old woman said, staring at George over her teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. "You're growing up too fast. Boys who grow up too fast become stupid and lazy." "But I can't help it if I'm growing too fast, Grandma," George said. "Course you can," she snapped. "Growing is a nasty children's habit. But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups. Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only very little, the old woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty childhood habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of those things, have you? I'm still only a little boy, Grandma. You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? It's ridiculous, she said. You're not nearly as tall as me already. George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny little person. Her legs were so short that she had to have a footstool to put up her feet, and her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, George said. Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself from growing? Said George. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? Makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Cabbage? Oh no, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like and what you don't like. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in it, so much the better. Ouch, said George. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mummy washes them down the sink, said George. Mummy is as stupid as you are, said Grandma. Cabbages don't taste of anything without a few small boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs too. Not slugs, George cried out. I can't eat slugs. Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quick before it crawls away. Delicious. She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. You're joking, Grandma. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They go crunch. Oh, Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned, showing her pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside the stick of a celery. That's what I like. Oh, Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in a stick of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. Don't want to hear about it, cried George. A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be quick, my dear. When you put one of those in your mouth, It's got a pair of really sharp nippers on its back end, and if it grabs your tongue with those, it never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig, chop chop, before it bites you. George started to edge towards the door. He wanted to get as far away from this woman, this filthy old woman. "You're trying to get away from me," she said, pointing a finger straight in George's face. "You're trying to get away from Grandma." Little George stood by the door, staring at the old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He'd always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he wasn't so sure. "Come closer to me, little boy," she said, beckoning him with a horny finger. "Come closer to me and I'll tell you secrets." George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. "I know a great many secrets," she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was an icy thin smile, the kind a snake might make before it bites you. "Come over here to Grandma and she'll whisper some secrets to you." George took another step backwards, edging closer towards the door. "You mustn't be frightened of your old Grandma," she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backwards. "Some of us," she said, and all at once she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering in a kind of throaty voice that George had never heard her use before. "Some of us," she said, "have magic powers that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes." A tingle of electricity flashed down George's spine. He began to feel frightened. "Some of us," the old woman went on, "have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry at the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand straight up on the end and your eyes pop out of their sockets." George wanted to run away, but his feet just seemed stuck to the floor. "We know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingernails instead." George began to tremble. It was a face that frightened him most of all, that frosty smile and those brilliant, unblinking eyes. "We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you." "Grandma!" he cried. "Stop it!" "We know a great many secrets, dear, about dark places where things live and squirm and slither all over each other." George made a dive for the door. "It doesn't matter how far you run," he heard her say. "You won't ever get away." George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Chapter 2. A Marvellous